I'm delighted that he could be here with us tonight. He's a walking encyclopedia about Pittsburgh, as I say. And so without further ado, Bill, please take it away.
All right, very good. Okay, keep eating, still bring coffee. We might pause so they can take your dessert order. Let's see, I'm going to use the mic because I think there are people next door. And even though I have a big voice from 30 years in television, it might help you all if I just use the mic to talk. So once again, welcome to our guests. On behalf of all the Pittsburghers, it's great to have you all here. I think there's nothing better than those of us who live in Pittsburgh love to do than show off our town and what's been achieved here. And what I thought I'd talk to you about tonight is really what an achievement it has been. Give you a little context of what you're really seeing out the window and how truly remarkable that view is, and in some ways how truly remarkable the Pittsburgh story has been from the very beginning. But I had the opportunity this afternoon to run out to the Carnegie Museum and get a quick tour. I think I spent 15 minutes or so with with Professor Audubon. Or where is he? There he is. There he is. Yes, he was great. But he ran me through there like we dashed through the exhibit. But he gave me a great context of the incredible, rich history of Arabia, going back much, much farther than I ever thought about it. And it was truly remarkable. And I think after we were done, I realized that Pittsburgh and Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula actually have two things in common and one thing completely not in common. So I thought I would talk to you tonight about the two things we have in common and the one thing we don't have in common. And I'm going to start with the one thing we don't have in common, and that is our age. I think Simon was the one who says Pittsburgh is one of the oldest cities in the United States, and that's a little bit of an exaggeration. Pittsburgh's about 255 years old. Philadelphia, Boston, New York, of course, are older than Pittsburgh, the coastal cities that were settled first. But we're 250 or so, 255 years old. About 5 years ago, I had the honor to be the executive director of the Pittsburgh 250th anniversary celebration, which was a 14-county celebration of Pittsburgh's history, and that was terrific. And yes, in the United States, 250 years is old, right? The country itself is not 250 years old. So it was something really to be proud of and something to be celebrated. But what I learned today is that depending on how you want to talk about history, and I mean, if you talk about prehistory, the Arabian Peninsula pushes it back millions of years. They have artifacts in this exhibit that go all the way back to what? Paleolithic times. Rocks, and you can see where they knock the pieces off the rocks to create cutting tools and scraping tools and all this kind of stuff. The very first humans coming out of Africa, crossing the Arabian Peninsula to settle the rest of the world. It's an incredible story, but I think what I was most blown away by was the evidence of a real culture, if not a civilization, 9,000 years ago. On the Arabian Peninsula, they have this incredible statue there, stone sculpture, 9,000 years old, of a horse. And it was a pretty darn good sculpture. If somebody did it today, you'd probably buy it in a gallery in New York and think you got a real steal. It's an incredible sculpture, and it really shows the development, the civilization, the culture, what had happened in Arabia 9,000 years ago. But that wasn't the most impressive thing I saw. The most impressive thing of everything there, and they've got everything from an old door from the Kaaba, right? Did I pronounce that correctly? Yes, they have an actual real door that was there until the 1940s, and these incredible pieces of gold and all these other sculptures. But I think what I thought was the most incredible thing in the entire exhibit was that stone dagger. 9,000 years old. I think it was not 9,000 years old, it was thousands of years old. Stone dagger. And I was thinking, well, you've all seen old stone daggers, right? We have them around here, the Clovis kind of points and stuff that the early, people who settled America used, and they kind of chipped away and created knives and stone tools and blades and things. This dagger, though, carved out of stone, had the curve in it. The way that you see a modern, an Arabian sword, a scimitar, or a modern dagger with the curve in it, the crescent curve made out of steel. Somebody carved that out of stone 9,000 years ago. And that culture then comes all the way up to the day, because you go out to the front of the exhibit, the modern times, the current Saudi Arabia, and there's this beautiful sword, and sure enough, it has the same curve in it that some craftsman had carved out of a stone 9,000 years ago. Talk about continuity of culture and how that plays through today. So I guess fortunately for all of you, our history does not go back 9,000 years, because we'd be here until tomorrow morning if I were going to try to tell you any more about that history. I think I can actually handle the 250-year history of Pittsburgh in about 10 minutes. So that's what I'm going to do tonight. And I'm going to start first with one of the things that I found out today that Pittsburgh has in common with Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula. And that is a place that from the very beginning was a crossroads. And you can look out the window here, and for those of you who are new to the region, these are of course the three rivers that Pittsburgh is so famous for. That's the Allegheny River flowing down there in the middle, flows all the way down from upstate New York and winds up coming in here to Pittsburgh. That's the Monongahela River, and it flows up from West Virginia. The Monongahela, interestingly enough, is one of the few navigable rivers in the world that flows from south to north. Those of you from the Middle East might be able to think of another one. The Monongahela, that's the Monongahela that comes up here to the confluence here in Pittsburgh and then flows on down to form the Ohio River, right there where that fountain is at the point. That's the beginning of the Ohio River. And you sail down the Ohio River, and you're going to wind up in Illinois at Cairo, and then you will join the Mississippi River, and you will flow down the Mississippi River all the way to New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico, connecting Pittsburgh all the way to the Gulf, but also around St. Louis you can connect to the Missouri River, and you can go upstream almost all the way to the Rocky Mountains. So from the very beginning, these rivers were highways. These were the highways that made it possible to settle the North American continent. And it was really obvious from the very first settlers who came here. George Washington, the father of the United States, the first president, actually came here as a teenager, as a surveyor, sent here by the governor of Virginia to see what the French were up to, because the French were here in Pittsburgh as well. And he came here and he looked down at that point and he said, this is a great place for a fort. This is a strategic location, because whoever controls that flat piece of ground right over there will control the settlement of all of North America. And the French and the British went to war over that patch of ground down there, over the confluence of these three rivers, over that highway that ultimately would settle America. It was called the French and Indian War here in the Americas. In Europe, they call it the 7 Years' War. And in many ways, it was the first great world war, and it was fought for control of the ports of the Ohio, fought for control of Pittsburgh. And the world ultimately went to war to be able to secure this opportunity to be a crossroads to settle America. As we all know, the British won, and that's why most Americans speak English all the way to the Rocky Mountains. And so that was in 1758. George Washington and General John Forbes out of Scotland came here. They secured what used to be Fort Duquesne. You can kind of see the imprint down there in the park of the wooden stockade that the French had built here. And they settled Pittsburgh, named it after William Pitt, who went on to become the Prime Minister of England, and built another fort down there. You can see the one bastion, the music bastion, that still stands. It's part of the Fort Pitt Museum. That was Fort Pitt, and that was built by the British to defend this part of America. And that was really Pittsburgh's beginning. Well, after the American Revolution, Pittsburgh truly began to become the gateway, the place that people had to come to settle the continent, to experience the rest of the Americas. And so Pittsburgh began to grow with settlers who were going to go down these rivers and settle this incredibly wide open territory all the way to the west. So some settlers did that. They got on keel boats here and other kinds of barges and pushed off and went downriver. Of course, others stayed behind. They didn't want the risks of going out there to settle the west and have to deal with the Native Americans who didn't really want all these Europeans coming into their country, into their countryside. So some stayed behind, and they made the supplies for the settlers that were going to go down, down the Ohio to settle America. And so industry began to take hold here in Pittsburgh. So a lot of us here, even here in Pittsburgh, people will tell you it's the rivers. It's always been about the rivers. Those were the highways. Those were the crossroads. That's what made it possible to open the West. And in fact, Pittsburgh was called for many years. It was the original gateway to the West in America. But that's not why Pittsburgh grew into a great industrial center. Not just because of it. Yeah, we needed the rivers. But the really key ingredient was right under our feet here tonight, here under Mount Washington. Because for most of its history, this hill was called Coal Hill. turned out to be one of the richest coal deposits on the planet. Not that far beneath your feet, there was a seam of coal, literally named the Pittsburgh Coal Seam, that stretches from here for almost 100 miles down into West Virginia. Its official name is actually the Pittsburgh Coal Seam. And so in 1760, just 2 years after George Washington and General Ford named Pittsburgh, they started mining the coal underneath this hillside, mining the coal underneath Coal Hill. And the great thing was, in those days, you could bring the coal down there to the flatlands, to the strip there by the river. That river, most of the year, was so shallow you could wade across it. So if you had a little barge, you could toss the coal on it. You could literally walk it across to the only flat land for miles around, right over there where downtown Pittsburgh is today, and that coal could power your foundries and factories and forges and everything else you knew to begin to manufacture the goods that the settlers needed who were going west. And so it was that combination of fire and of water, of energy, of coal and of the rivers, of energy and transportation that ultimately turned Pittsburgh into one of the world's great industrial centers. And so as that began to happen, as the continent was settled, people began to come here from all over the world. I learned today about the crossroads of the incense trade, and then the spice trade, and the people from both sides of Arabia who were coming and going for thousands of years to drive that economy, and then the things that were being manufactured there, that were being sold to those traders, who were then taking them all over the world, or the world of that day. Well, the same thing began to happen here in Pittsburgh. People came and they headed downriver, and they stayed here and they manufactured and they made the supplies. And they came here from all over Europe, and they began to settle, and they populated the factories, and they populated the hillsides. And in the first half of the 19th century, Pittsburgh began to grow and grow and grow, as people knew that this was a magnet to opportunity, not just the gateway to the west, but the gateway to the opportunity right here. So by 1860, by the American Civil War, Pittsburgh was producing half the steel and 1/3 of the glass in the United States of America. An incredibly powerful industrial center by the American Civil War in 1760 to 1765. But they had a problem.
1860.
Thank you. I'm getting my centuries mixed up. 1865. But they actually had a problem by the 1850s with this growing industrial might. Here and also in the eastern United States and in Europe, there was an enormous demand for oil. Not the kind of oil we think about today. It was lamp oil. It was what kept the lights on in the houses and the factories and the businesses and the offices. And by the 1850s, the world was starting to run out of whales. Literally, the whalers had almost exterminated all the whales in the North Atlantic and the South Atlantic. They were starting to sail around the tip of Africa. They were sailing around the tip of South America, and they were going to catch more whales and exterminate them. And across the industrialized, civilized world, there was growing concern that the world was at peak whale. What would they do? If they ran out of whales, the lights would go out. If they ran out of whales, the lights would go out and civilization would collapse. You wouldn't be able to use this, wouldn't be able to support this incredible industrial economy. So as often happens when you have a problem like that, you usually get a couple of bright entrepreneurs who step up and think, you know what? Problem means opportunity. If I can figure this one out, there's probably money to be made, or there's a business to be built here. And so the first one of those entrepreneurs was a guy from not far from here, about 35 miles in that direction in Indiana County, a guy named Sam Keir. And Sam Keir was actually a canal boat captain. There used to be a statewide canal, railroad and canal boats that went all the way across Pennsylvania, across the mountains from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. And Sam was a canal boat captain. And Sam saw when he was out on his boats this scum that would kind of bubble up out of the surface here, and it would cover the surface of the canal. It was this useless black liquid. They all knew about it. It was called petroleum. Nobody knew what to do with it, but you know, it fouled wells. Every now and then it would catch on fire. It was a total nuisance, but had absolutely no practical purpose. But Sam Keir looked at the petroleum that he could skim off the top of the canal and some ponds and other places around here, and he thought, you know what? Maybe there's something inside. We know it burns. Maybe there's something inside this petroleum. If we could distill it, maybe we could get something useful out of it that would be an alternative to lamp oil, and I could somehow replace the lamp oil market. So Sam Keir literally built the world's first commercial oil refinery in downtown Pittsburgh. And you see that big tall black building over there, the one with UPMC along the top? That's the headquarters of United States Steel, of course, the headquarters of UPMC. Well, that building stands on the site of the world's first commercial oil refinery. And sure enough, Sam Keir was able to refine that petroleum and come up with a useful liquid that would be a rival for whale oil, and it was called kerosene. There was another bright young man here in Pittsburgh, in western Pennsylvania at the time, a guy named Ed Drake, Colonel Drake. He actually wasn't a colonel. They gave him that name so he would have credibility with the investors, and they thought they would treat him with more respect if he claimed to be a colonel, so they gave him the title so that he could raise money. Some of you may have encountered that sort of thing in your own life. But at any rate, Ed Drake hears about Sam Keir's discovery, and now, son of a gun, there's actually something you can do with this petroleum. There might be a market for it. But I can't skim it off all the ponds around here. That's not commercially viable. That's not going to replace the volumes we need from the whales. So Colonel Drake says, you know what? I'm going to take salt well drilling technology from Ohio, where they used to drill for salt brine back in those days when, before refrigeration, you needed salt, of course, to keep your meat fresh, right? So cure meat and everything else. He said, I wonder if I could take that technology. I'll take it about 100 miles north of Pittsburgh, up around Titusville, up in that direction. I'm going to see if I can drill down, and maybe, just maybe, it's possible to hit this petroleum and bring it up to the surface in commercial quantities. And so in 1859, that's just what Colonel Drake did. He drilled the world's first oil well about 100 miles north of Pittsburgh in Titusville. And that started the world's first great oil boom. People began to pour in from Pittsburgh from all around the world. They came over from Cleveland, including a bright young man named John D. Rockefeller, who came to take advantage of the incredible energy resource here. And their oil refineries began to spring up all around Pittsburgh and in Cleveland, all up and down the western Pennsylvania-Ohio line, as they began to produce kerosene in mass quantities to be able to meet this incredible demand to keep the lights on. And that is indeed how Pittsburgh saved the whales. But they created another problem in doing that. Because you know what? When you drill for the whales and you had all these wells, and these wells at this point were all over the place. They didn't come all the way down here. They were a little north of here. But you had all these oil wells, and the trouble they had was this pesky gas came to the surface with the darn oil. And they now knew what to do with the oil, but they couldn't figure out what to do with the gas. It blew up the wells, so they just flared it off. It had no other practical purpose, right? So if you had come to western Pennsylvania about 150 years ago, 130, 150 years ago, you would have seen oil derricks everywhere, all across the countryside, and every single one would have been flaring off gas in enormous quantities just to be able to get rid of it because it was so dangerous. Well, of course, anytime you have a problem like that, some bright entrepreneur thinks there's probably some money to be made and thinks if I could solve that problem, I might be able to start a company. So there was another fellow here in Pittsburgh, actually a railroad man, young fellow from Schenectady, New York. He would have been from up there, again, at the headwaters of the Allegheny, a guy named George Westinghouse. And Westinghouse had come to Pittsburgh in the late 1860s with an idea for the railroad air brake. He was the first guy that figured out how you could stop all the cars in a train at the same time. It's one of the most important inventions of the 19th century because you could have bigger, faster trains to keep up with the enormous industrial expansion that was happening. So Westinghouse, the air brake, of course, was involved with pressure, so he got kind of intrigued by this problem of, well, what do you do with gas? How can you manipulate gas? Could I solve this problem? Could I turn this useless gas into a useful product? So Westinghouse had his house, and his land was about, 7 miles or so straight out there. Actually, if you go up the Allegheny River, you can see some big buildings up there just this side of the last ridge, the last trees up there. That's the brand new Children's Hospital that's part of UPMC. If you go a little farther to the right, kind of where that big water tank is right on the horizon, that's very near Homewood, which is where George Westinghouse's house was. And Mr. Westinghouse drilled 4 test gas wells in his backyard, just so he could play around with it. And he had a shop in his house. Now, my guess is his shop was probably bigger than most of ours. He probably had everything you could tinker with, in the 1870s or so to try to puzzle this out. And Westinghouse personally developed most of the early technologies to produce and manipulate and distribute natural gas. And all the early patents related to natural gas were developed by George Westinghouse, pretty much working in his backyard here in Pittsburgh in the second half of the 19th century. And when he had it puzzled out, Mr. Westinghouse decided, I'd figure this out. I'm going to create a retail natural gas company, and I'm going to now pipe this gas all over Pittsburgh, and we're going to use it to light the lights and heat the homes, And it's going to be a new alternative to kerosene, another alternative to whale oil. So he created a company, and his company is still in business today. You can't really see it from here, but just on the, you kind of can, just on the other side of the Highmark building, you'll see the next tall building, and right there on the corner, on the upper right corner, is EQT. And that was the old Equitable Gas Company, and that was the world's first retail natural gas company that was here in Pittsburgh. Founded by George Westinghouse, still based here today, and is now today one of the largest exploration companies for natural gas in West Virginia and Western Pennsylvania. And so that really ignited an energy boom here in southwestern Pennsylvania. Now it was oil and gas. The first oil well, the first commercial natural gas well was about 16 miles that way. Also drilled by Equitable Gas. The first oil and gas pipelines were constructed here in western Pennsylvania as part of the boom, and people flocked here to be able to take part in all of this. Westinghouse, of course, was a really interesting guy because he started out in the railroad business, then he got into the natural gas business, but then he got intrigued by this newfangled thing that he thought might be an alternative to both kerosene and whale oil for lighting, and of course that was electricity. And George Westinghouse, very successful companies here, he's doing very good business, and a young engineer showed up on his doorstep, a guy named Nikola Tesla. He'd had a falling out with Thomas Edison over whether to power the grid with direct current or alternating current. So he shows up on George Westinghouse's doorstep and he said, Mr. Westinghouse, I have solved this problem, I need your help, we're going to electrify America with alternating current. And Westinghouse said, okay, I like that idea, let's go for it, we're going to do it. And I've often wondered why. You know, Westinghouse ultimately won the current wars. All these lights are operating on alternating current. What did he see that Thomas Edison didn't see? How did Westinghouse get it? And Thomas Edison, the most prolific, one of the greatest inventors in world history, didn't see alternating current and why that had to be the solution. And I'm convinced that it was because it was a problem in pressure. Just like the air brake, just like natural gas, if you think of voltage in an electric line as pressure of the electrons flowing through the line, what do you have to do with alternating current? You step up the pressure to move it a long way, and you step it down to light the light or power the machine or whatever else. So at the end of the day, George Westinghouse was really a one-note wonder, right? It was all about pressure. Yeah, you give him any problem having to do with pressure, he figured it out. He got Nikola Tesla, and ultimately they won the current wars. And the Westinghouse engineers, and if you go up this river, up the Monongahela River, and then take a left and go up Turtle Creek a couple more miles to East Pittsburgh, the Westinghouse Valley they call it, that was sort of the mothership for the creation of alternating current, the electric motor, the electric transformer, the circuit breaker, you name almost any component it takes to make the grid work. They were all developed here in Pittsburgh in the late 19th century, I think about 125 years ago, Danny, that's what you said. And so it was an incredible story. Pittsburgh now had this unlimited energy, this unlimited expertise, and we were becoming the world steel center. And the Alcoa, the Pittsburgh Reduction Company, had set up shop here in Pittsburgh with this idea to mass produce aluminum, another part of our material science heritage, to go with our steel heritage that was booming in the Monongahela Valley by the time we got to the turn of the last century. And Pittsburgh was the Silicon Valley of the world at the turn of the last century. If you were a bright young entrepreneur, this is the place you had to be. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the movie Titanic, but the brash, young, obnoxious entrepreneur who shows up on the boat for the maiden voyage to New York was a kid from Pittsburgh. Because in 1912, this is where you would come, this is where you had to be. This was where the great ideas and the great investment was happening, and the world was being reinvented all over the place at this point. So it was an incredible story. By the turn of the last century, Pittsburgh had the third highest per capita concentration of wealth in the United States of America, after New York and Chicago. It was an incredibly wealthy and incredibly powerful place. And it continued to grow through the first half of the 20th century, that incredible industrial engine, until by the Second World War, the industrial might 24 vertically integrated steel mills along all these rivers. They went up the Monongahela for miles, they went up the Allegheny for miles, they went down the Ohio for 60 miles. Steel mill after steel mill, each one of them miles long, producing this incredible industrial output, so that during the Second World War, Pittsburgh produced more steel than Germany and Japan combined. Just Pittsburgh, not the United States of America, just Pittsburgh. That was the incredible industrial output that was happening all around us here by the Second World War. But Pittsburgh paid an enormous price for that incredible success, for that enormous wealth creation, for all that innovation, all that opportunity, for being a magnet that brought people here from all around the world. Pittsburgh paid ultimately a terrible price, and that was one of the most degraded environments anywhere in the world by the 1940s. If you had stood up here on this mountain in the 1940s, there would be no reason to have a restaurant here, because you would have seen nothing. The valley was filled with smoke, the skies were filled with smoke, the ash rained from the sky 24 hours a day, 24/7, 365 days a year. Everything was black. The buildings here were covered with soot. Everything was black. There was not a tree on Mount Washington, this hillside that we're above, not a single tree in the 1920s and 1930s. They'd all been cut down for coal mining. An incredibly disrupted environment. The rivers were polluted. They were flowing with sewage and industrial pollution. There were no fish in the rivers. God forbid you would ever go down there to swim or for recreation. It was awful. Your parents, if you were a kid, stay away from those rivers. You don't want to go to the rivers. And they flooded every spring, an enormous flood that would flood the entire downtown because there was no way to control the flood control. And so the civic leaders in Pittsburgh in those days, in the 1940s, began to get concerned. This was in 1943, 70 years ago this year. And they looked around, led by the president of Carnegie Tech. And he said, you know what? Without the artificial stimulus of this war, and the war was still in doubt at that point. That was before D-Day, right? So there was no assurance that the Allies would win. But they looked around and they said, and the president of Carnegie said, you know, we're not sure we're going to be able to compete. How will we be able to attract people? How will we be able to retain our best and brightest? This place is unlivable. It's awful. We're not going to be competitive. We're not going to be able to build a future here in Pittsburgh. And so they came together as civic leaders in Pittsburgh, government, university, business, and they formed the organization that I work for, the Allegheny Conference on Community Development. And it arguably was the first public-private partnership organization in the United States. It was formed as a vehicle to bring together the business community, to then be able to work in partnership with government to re-engineer Pittsburgh and create a whole new place, a competitive place that could succeed and be successful in the world. And so they created the Allegheny Conference, formally formed in 1944. So our 70th anniversary will be next year. And they took on an ambitious plan to clean up Pittsburgh. They had 4 objectives. They were going to clean up the smoky skies. They were going to clean up the rivers and introduce regional sewer treatment and clean up the rivers by better filtering the water. They were going to take care of the flood control. They were going to build enormous reservoirs and dams for dozens of miles all around Pittsburgh that would trap the snow in the winter and hold it in the reservoirs, and then they would gradually release it over the summer so that they could maintain navigation in the rivers and prevent the floods. And then finally they said, and we're going to do urban redevelopment. We're going to take that old rail yard and freight yard that filled the entire lower part of downtown Pittsburgh, all the way back to that big black building there, the one in front, the one on the right there. That's actually the former headquarters of the Westinghouse Electric Corporation, that black building. That's where my offices are today. That entire area was a rail yard, a freight yard. It was an urban slum, completely run down. And they said, we're going to level it all. And in 1944, they said, and you know what? We're going to build a park, and we're going to build a fountain in the park as a symbol of a new Pittsburgh and our pure environment and our pure water. And that's what they did. And in 1974, 30 years later, they turned on that fountain that you see down there. So an incredible story of civic leadership and commitment and sticking with it for a generation by largely a group of businessmen who were making money hand over fist and had no real reason, when you think about it, to engage and provide that kind of leadership and clean up this place. It would have been so easy to just take the money and run. And instead, they re-engineered Pittsburgh. And so by 1974, essentially the skyline as you see it, with the exception of a few buildings, the park, the fountain, the rivers were clean, the smoke was gone, and in 30 years they'd sort of achieved what we call Renaissance 1. And that's when the steel industry collapsed. In the late 1970s and the early 1980s, Pittsburgh lost 10% of all the jobs in the region, net loss. Over 100,000 net loss of jobs, 250,000 manufacturing jobs gone in 3 years. In 1983, 30 years ago this year, the metropolitan unemployment rate was 18.3%. It was a depression. It wasn't a recession. There was a global recession at the time, but what happened in Pittsburgh was a depression. I got here in 1982, so I got here the year before the bottom, before Pittsburgh hit rock bottom. The next year, in 1984, 50,000 people moved away. 50,000 people all left. Over the whole period of the bust and before the recovery, we lost over 200,000 people who left this region. And you think about who left. They weren't the experienced old hands working in our factories running Pittsburgh. It was a seniority system, right? If you were the last one hired, you were the first one fired. So who did we fire? Who left? All of our 20-somethings, all of our young people. There was nothing here for them. And so they moved all the way across America. They moved to the Southwest, they moved to the South, they moved to California, and they left Pittsburgh. And they left Pittsburgh with a severely devastated economy and losing that brain power and that enthusiasm and all that potential of youth. But fortunately, another group of community leaders, civic leaders, came together again, the same power of Pittsburgh, to bring together business, government, nonprofits, the universities, and now the foundations. And they said, you know what? We're not going to give up. We reinvented Pittsburgh once before. We're going to do it again. And so they kept the best of the old. We still make things here. We're still a significant manufacturing center. They kept the energy industry. We're still arguably the most diverse energy center in the United States of America. Many of those companies, we've heard from a few of them tonight, are still here. They still call Pittsburgh home. And we kept our banking. Those VCs, the venture capitalists, the folks who had invented in the entrepreneurs and the innovation and the opportunity, and our financial system stayed in place. But then we did something more. We took the wealth that those industries had created and were creating, and we invested it through our colleges and universities in our people, in innovation, and in entrepreneurship, in commercializing technologies to reinvent the old industries, and in bringing new technologies to market through new businesses. And so over the last 30 years, we've created 2 whole new industries to go with the 3 big ones we had before. So in addition to energy, finance, and manufacturing today, we have healthcare and life sciences, and we have information and communications technology. Today we have more than about 200,000 people working in healthcare, only about 100,000 in manufacturing, so we've swapped. But we still have that engine of manufacturing and energy and finance to power it all and make it work. And over the last 30 years, Pittsburgh has rebuilt its economy. Until today, there are more people moving in every year than are leaving. And over the last 5 years, Pittsburgh was one of the first 3 metros in the United States to fully recover from the Great Recession and to come out of it now with this new diverse economy. And we did one other thing that was really important. We invested in our quality of life. We invested in place. Just as they had done 70 years ago, we invested in arts and culture in our cultural district. We invested in outdoor recreation with a park and riverfront trails and a trail that goes all the way to Washington, D.C., and we invested in intelligent building and green building. We built the world's largest green convention center. You can't really see it from here, but if you go up the Allegheny just to the bend there where that Black Railroad Bridge is, that's the David L. Lawrence Convention Center, and when we built that, it was the largest green building in the world. And that jump-started a whole new industry based on material science and innovation in our universities that's now turned into a significant industry in Pittsburgh around intelligent building and green building as well. So we've engineered an incredible recovery over the last 30 years to go with the 30 years of before, and now we're looking to the future. And history is beginning to repeat itself, because just about 9 years ago in Westmoreland County, about 40, 50 miles in that direction, a young geologist, Pittsburgh guy from Range Resources, heard about this opportunity in this unusual rock formation called the Marcellus Shale. There'd been some success down in Texas in similar formations, and he thought, you know what, maybe we should drill down there and see if there's any natural gas. And so in 2004, Range Resources drilled a test well, about 50 miles down there, and struck gas in the Marcellus. And over the last 9 years, we have learned that it appears to be the 2nd largest proven natural gas reserve in the world, second only to one in Iran. And that one's a little harder for us to get to. So we're now sitting on this enormous natural gas reserve. We're central to the primary industrial markets in the United States and in Canada. And a whole new opportunity is starting all over again here in Pittsburgh in 2013. Not unlike the way that Colonel Drake hit oil 150 years ago up in Titusville. And so I'll leave you with that thought. I'll leave you with 2 thoughts. One is, when you look out that window and you see that view, I think one of the most important lessons you can take home from Pittsburgh is that nothing you see out that window just happened. Everything you see out that window happened because people made it happen. And because civic leaders, business people, government, nonprofits, the universities said we can create a better place. And when our economy collapsed, they said we can fix that too, and we can bring this community back. Pittsburgh is one of the world's greatest testaments to civic engineering and to the ability to make change if you have a great plan, a big plan, and you're willing to stick with it over a generation. So what does the future hold? I think there's an incredible upside, but I think we're very much not all that different from Colonel Drake. You know, when Colonel Drake drilled his well back in 1859, and if you rolled the clock forward 9 years, and it would have been, what, 1868 or so. You know, when Colonel Drake struck oil, all he was trying to do was find an alternative for lamp oil, right? He was looking for kerosene, and he solved that problem. There was no way he could have predicted that stuff, that ability to refine petroleum, would eventually lead to gasoline and the automobile and to powered flight, and that you could take that feedstock and you could make plastics out of it in the entire petrochemical industry, and then over the next 50 years, think about it, from the time he struck oil here in 1859 until the turn of that century, the modern world would have been created, all because of a discovery by one entrepreneur with a bright idea here in Pittsburgh. So I think here we are in 2013, just 9 years after Range Resources struck gas in western Pennsylvania. And I'm thinking, we don't know anything more about what lies ahead than Colonel Drake knew in around 1868. And that in a lot of ways for Pittsburgh, it is 1868 all over again. It's a great time. I wish I could tell you what the future holds, and maybe collectively we can figure it out. Thank you all so much.
As I say, I always learn so much when Bill speaks. We have actually some tremendous desserts. The gentleman here is going to say what we have, and then he'll come around and we'll just tell him what